Chapter 4. The Library of Warm Mornings. The Somnia sailed with the ease of a slow heartbeat, her sails cradling the wind as if it were a sleeping child. Liora stood near the bow with her sea rose lantern cupped in both hands, and the lantern's glow moved with the ship's breath, brightening with each rise, softening on each fall. The sky was a dark velvet quilt stitched with stars, and yet, ahead, the water began to glow in a color that did not belong to night. It was not the pale silver the moon likes to spill on the world, nor the glassy green of harbor beacons. This glow was the color of bread pulled from an oven. It was tea poured into a chilled cup, turning it warm from the bottom. It was the shy gold that lingers in a room after someone says the word morning. The captain came to stand beside her. He did not point. No one pointed at this place. He had once told her, "You come to it the way you come to remembering something you loved and forgot. Breathe easy when we touch the pier," he said. "The library hears every breath as if it were a footstep." "The library?" Liora asked, though she had already guessed. The glow ahead carried the softness of pages. "The Library of Warm Mornings," the captain replied. "Some say it's where dawn goes to rest while the moon mines the sky." The Somnia kissed the pier without a thud. Leora's lantern brightened, reflecting along the moorings, and she stepped out with the sort of care one gives to a sleeping house. The harbor town, if there was one, hid itself behind hedges of rosemary and low walls thick with moss. There were no shouts from fishmongers, no clatter of carts. Only a hush, and the hush smelled faintly of toasted oats and of paper that has enjoyed the sun. She followed the warm light to a building that first pretended to be small and then forgot its pretense. From a distance, it looked like a cottage cousin to the sea, squat and friendly, its roof shouldered with ivy. But as Liora walked closer, the walls rose like a deep breath. The roofline climbed and unfurled. Windows stretched taller. The door widened and then narrowed with a kind of shy dignity, until she found herself standing before a pair of wooden leaves carved with rays and little luminous motes, as if hands had once tried to carve sunlight into wood and come surprisingly close. The door opened without touching. A sigh inside sighed back, the sound of benches settling and so many pages moving just a little to make room. The library was the size of a thought that grows when it's listened to. Shelves spiraled from the floor like trunks that had learned patience, branching into smaller shelves that cupped books the way a palm cups water. Some spines were leather as smooth as river stones. Some were woven as if out of morning mist. Some were stitched with threads that caught the light and threw it back gently. Stairs curled away into low galleries. Ladders leaned the way old friends lean into one another. The windows were made of thick glass seeded with tiny bubbles that turned lamplight into something tender. Liora reached for a narrow blue volume humming ever so faintly and found its cover fixed as if it were a shell fused by time. She tried another, and it, too, refused her. An arm's length away, a child swung their feet on a stool and pressed their cheek against a silk-bound book that would not open, either. Neither child nor book seemed offended. Both were simply waiting for something Liora had not yet remembered. "Not with hands first," said a voice that tasted like honey on the air. The librarian approached without hurry, their robe the color of dawn before birds decide what tune to sing. Their hair, white as the wake of a gull, fell in a loose braid over one shoulder. Lines at their eyes belonged to someone who had smiled often and without apology. They carried no keys, no quills, no spectacles on a chain. Only a little cup that steamed and smelled of chamomile. "Welcome," the librarian said, as if welcoming were the only true work in the world. "You'll find they prefer to be breathed open." "Breathed open," Liora repeated, because sometimes repeating the unusual is how you make a small home for it in your mind. "Books of morning are shy around hurry," the librarian said. "They trust the lungs that remember slow." The child on the stool lifted their head. "I forgot slow," they confessed. "I forgot it at the gate." "That's all right," said the librarian. "Slow is not a thing that stays where you put it. Slow is a thing you meet again and again." The librarian led Liora to the central hall where a shallow pool of light had gathered, warm enough to wash the chill from the night. Cushions were arranged in a wide circle around a low table set with a tray of cups and a clay pot that breathed out steam. In the pool of light, dust motes rose and fell like very small, well-behaved stars. Liora sat with her lantern at her knee, the sea rose glow mingling with the library's gentle gold. First, sit the way a cat sits when it has nothing to prove, the librarian said, which is always. They set the tea near Leora's ankles with a smile and placed a book on her lap that felt like a warmed stone. Its cover was cloth, sunrise-colored, the weave made visible by use as much as by craft. It did not open to her hand. Listen to your breath as if it were a tide, the librarian said. Waves do not arrive sooner because you tell them to. They do not leave later because you plead. They keep their own good rhythm. Borrow it. Leora closed her eyes. In her chest a flock of small, impatient birds flitted and pecked. She could feel the old hurry tug at her, habit masquerading as necessity. So she reached back to the memory of the town where clocks slept, where minutes folded their hands and waited. She let that remembering weigh her shoulders down from her ears. She let it soften her jaw. She invited her breath to swell and empty, not all at once, not perfectly, only kindly. The lantern's light answered, its pulse finding the same pace. A soft sound came from the book. Not a click, not a snap, but a little release, like a sigh of cloth untangling. The cover loosened under her fingers. The first page lifted without crinkling and unfolded as a petal does when no one is watching. Words lifted off the page as steam lifts from tea on winter mornings, visible and then not, and the library seemed to lean in to smell them. The words did not march. They drifted and found their places again. Leora read, and the reading did not feel like counting. It felt like letting. The story was a meadow with no fence. She walked there. She was there, and understood at once that everything moved, but nothing rushed. A bee's fur rippled with pollen as it landed on the open palm of a flower that had not once consulted a clock. A brook learned the language of every stone by taking the time to listen with water. A boy napped in the shade of a haystack with a dog's head on his stomach, and his dreams went nowhere and everywhere at once. Leora knelt and pressed her ear to the ground and could hear the tiny work of roots. When the page turned, it was her breath that turned it. When the story parted around a thorn, it was her patience that parted it. She closed the book by placing her palm on the cover and waiting for the words to settle back inside like birds returning to a familiar bough. The lantern had brightened without boasting. It simply shone like something that knew it belonged. Good, the librarian murmured. Now try a harder door. They led her through an aisle where taller shelves stood at attention, guarding a row of books bound in gray cloth. On each spine, a title stamped faintly in pewter leaf. The Book of Rushed Hearts, said the one the librarian drew out. It was heavier than it looked, as if it had learned to anchor itself during storms. This one resists, the librarian warned, but not to punish, only to teach. They laid it across Leora's knees. Open too quickly, and it shuts. Breathe shallow, and it blurs. But sometimes it opens for the sake of trying. Leora nodded, though the nod had more courage than she felt. She set the book on the table, and her hands curled around the edges as if holding a boat at a dock. She listened for the tide in her chest, but found instead a storm. She made the mistake of deciding to be calm. The book did not like decisions made in a hurry. It clamped. She closed her eyes again. Let the storm throw its last tantrum and tire itself out, the way storms do. She thought of the compass she had been given on the voyage, a compass that pointed not north, but toward what mattered most. She asked it to point toward the next breath. It did. In. Out. The lock of her jaw unlatched with its own small kindness. The gray cloth warmed, and the book yielded a thumb's width. On the page stood a little town that measured everything because it did not know how to trust the feel of anything. Bread was sliced by millimeters. Laughter was rationed by seconds. Even the wind was asked in through windows by the inch. Children learned numbers before names. The town kept a schedule for singing that had no song in it. When storms came, the people put out buckets not to catch the rain but to keep account of it. The story did not scold the town. It held it the way a lap holds a crying child, firm enough not to drop, soft enough to be trusted. A woman in the town finally tired of measuring. She tired of tasting by weight and not by tongue. The morning she forgot to set her list, she found she had time to tie her daughter's braid without checking a clock. When she smiled, there was jam at the corner of her mouth, and she did not wipe it off until it had finished being sweet. The town clock still ticked, but some days it ticked to a different rhythm, and the town learned to let both rhythms exist. a shared heartbeat and a shared habit, and neither was an enemy. Each was only a tool. The book closed itself when it had said enough. It did not slam. It pressed its covers together the way a mouth presses lips after a hymn, not to silence the song, but to keep it warm inside. Hard doors opened to humble hands, the librarian said, and to the sort of patience that forgives itself for forgetting. They moved on. The library did not have wings, it had moods. In the mood of the Far East Hall, benches curved like commas. There, an old sailor as weathered as driftwood held a book that smelled of tar and apple peel. Liora sat beside him when he patted the space with a hand as knotted as rope. "Lost my eldest to a storm of my own temper," he said, uninvited and still welcomed by the listening of the room. Not lost like gone from the world. Lost like the door at the end of a long hall that we keep forgetting to reach. He breathed in like a man remembering he owned lungs. The book opened to a map whose lines quivered until his breath steadied, and then they settled into rivers with names that sounded like forgiveness. Liora did not read over his shoulder. She watched the way his chest moved, the deliberate ease of it, the spaces he gave his own sorrow to speak and then to be quiet. When he turned a page, the paper did not protest. It seemed grateful to be turned by someone who had stopped tugging at time. Across the hall, a child, perhaps the child from the stool, had discovered a book that made laughter have weight, not to burden it, but to prove it had substance. The laughter landed lightly on the rug and hopped like sparrows, and the librarian winked at Liora as if to say, "See, not everything that matters must be measured to be real, but sometimes letting it land is how it stops flying away." In a corner where light pooled like syrup, a russet-colored fox lay with its paws tucked neatly under like a letter sealed properly. Someone had draped a small knitted scarf over its shoulders, which the fox suffered with the resigned grace of the dignified. Before it, a book had opened not with words but with scent. Damp leaves, the shy musk of mushrooms, the white pepper of frost. The fox breathed in and out, whiskers trembling with the slow intelligence of animals, and the book answered by lifting a memory of last year's burrow into the air, showing it to the fox the way a mother shows a hidden lullaby to a fussing child. Liora felt the memory brush her cheek as a coolness, and the fox closed its eyes. "May I try another?" Liora asked, and the librarian nodded as if to say that asking is often the first door. They brought her to a case of thin books that were each wrapped in paper that had clearly been unwrapped many times, and then wrapped again because the pleasure was not in the keeping but in the ritual. The case was labeled The Morning Lessons of Small Things. Liora chose one that felt like the weight of a robin in her hand. It taught her the patience of toast, how the first scent is a promise, and the second is the arrival, and anything beyond is a lesson in watching closely. It showed her the courage of soft-boiled eggs that do not pretend to be anything but what they are. It explained the stance of a cup that has decided to be held and does not resent the fingerprints. In the margin, someone had written, in a hand like careful rain, * remember to taste. It takes no longer than not tasting does. It only seems to, because it asks you to arrive. * Liora smiled with her mouth, and with the places not on her face where smiles also live. Her lantern brightened again, not flaring, just gathering itself. She cupped the glass with her palm and felt how its warmth did not argue with the room's warmth, but joined it, as if warmth prefers to travel together. She was not always patient. The library did not pretend she was. In the hall of tomorrow's shelves, an airy room where ladders ascended into a pale haze as if into cloud, she grew too eager to climb. Titles glowed faintly up there, almost legible. A letter you will yet write. A friend you haven't met who needs you. The day you learn the long way is shorter. Leora's foot touched the first rung. Her breath jumped, and the ladder slid an inch out of reach. She laughed at herself. The way we laugh when we are caught wearing a hat we forgot sits absurdly on our head. She looked down. The librarian waited at the threshold, saying nothing because nothing was needed. Liora placed both feet back on the floor, and the rungs stopped their quiet retreat. Tomorrow would let her climb when today had been fully read. She tried a room where the ceiling hung low as a lullaby. It was the chamber of letters never sent. Boxes of pale envelopes lined the walls, each smelling faintly of the person who had written but never posted them. Black pepper, lavender, engine oil, rosemary, seawater. Leora chose one tied with twine. She did not open it. She simply held it and breathed until the paper softened and yielded its weight. And in the gentle gravity of that weight, there was the knowledge that some letters were not failures. They were rehearsals that taught the mouth how to shape courage before the day arrived. "Here," the librarian said softly later, and led her into a narrow corridor where the stone floor had been warmed by centuries of feet. At the end was a door carved with a little sun and a little moon holding hands. "Carry this." They placed in Leora's palm a candle whose wick had never been lit and yet smelled of old flame. The corridor breathed a draft that teased hair from her braid. "Take it to the end and back again," the librarian said. "This is the task we give to every reader who wishes to be a keeper, even if only for the small distance between one shelf and the next." "Keeper?" Leora asked. "Of mornings," the librarian said. "Not the time on a clock, but the way a thing begins when it is not frightened of itself." Leora struck a match. The flame woke as if from a pleasant dream. Her lantern at her hip could have lit the way, but it lowered its glow, and the two lights agreed between them how to share. The draft tried to curl fingers around the candle. Leora did not fight it with stiffness. Stiffness is how wind wins. She bent the flame into the draft's gentleness and walked the corridor with her arm the arc of a question mark. When her attention snagged on a thought that wanted to run ahead, the flame stuttered. When she let the thought pass like a cart going by a window, the flame steadied. On the return, a sprig of ivy brushed the wick. The flame bowed and recovered, like an apology accepted. The librarian's face creased deeper with approval when she returned the candle. "You will carry many mornings that are not yours," they said. "Sometimes for strangers. Sometimes for the part of yourself that forgets the way home. You know how now." Hours passed, though they did not step forward in the way they do in busy places. They diffused, as steam does, filling the space equally. Leora drank tea too slowly for a hurried life, and just right for this one. She read a book that was only photographs of shadows falling through different windows at different hours, and learned that each shadow tells the story of the thing that casts it and the thing that catches it. Two stories, braided. She sat with the sailor and listened to the page where his son's door stood at the end of the long hall. Together, they watched it open. Not fully. Doors have pride. But more than a crack, and that was more than yesterday. She asked the child on the stool what their book had said, and the child said, "It said if you hum to your own footsteps, they hum back," and demonstrated until the librarian gently shushed with a smile. She scratched the fox between the ears when invited, and the fox forgave her for not knowing precisely where the invitation ended. In the late of the middle of the night, the part of night that likes to pretend it isn't night, the librarian guided Leora to one last shelf. The books here were thin as leaves and tucked sideways into pockets like secret notes. "These are day seeds," the librarian said. "You don't open them here. You carry one until it opens of its own accord in the proper place." "How will I know which to take?" Leora asked. "Whichever becomes warm in your hand." She tried 3 before one answered. It did not warm all at once. It simply stopped being cool, the way a stone held long enough becomes your temperature. It had no title on the cover, only a small embossed that might have been a period or a sun. "Do I need to do anything?" Leora asked. "Breathe," the librarian said, "and be where you are when you are." They walked together back to the central hall where a woven rug had the geometry of a field scene from the back of a slow cart. The librarian poured one more cup of tea and, for the first time, sat. Silence stood beside them comfortably. At length, the librarian said, "There is one thing we ask of every reader who leaves." Leora looked up. "When you are given a morning," the librarian said, "do not hoard it. Use it to begin one thing, truly. It need not be large. It need not impress anyone. But begin it, even if all you begin is a long, deep breath." Leora swallowed around the ache of gratitude that sometimes feels like grief because you remember how often you forget what's good. "I will. Then our door will not close behind you," the librarian said. "It will wait." Leora stood. Her lantern had made a pool of sea rose light on the rug, and the gold of the library lay over it like honey over cream. They did not argue. They were both light. They knew how to live in the same bowl. She crossed the threshold with her day seed in her pocket and her candle unlit again, but smelling faintly of the corridor. The windows looked like jars of sunrise stored on a pantry shelf for winter. Outside, the harbor had not moved. not because time had stopped, but because it had sat with her and had no reason to hurry away. On the pier, the captain waited with his hat in his hands. Some people remove hats in the presence of holiness. The captain did so in the presence of libraries. "Did you find what you didn't know you were missing?" he asked. "Yes," Liora said. She could have said more. She did not need to. They cast off. The Somnia leaned into the moon's road, and the library's glow steadied behind them as if to light other travelers who would arrive when it was their turn to remember morning. Liora rested her elbows on the rail. The air had the bite of sea and the balm of tea. She touched her pocket and felt the day seed there, small as a coin, large as a promise. She closed her eyes, and behind them the meadow lingered, and the town that learned to sing off schedule, and the corridor and its flame, and the fox's whiskers like punctuation on a sentence she had been reading for a long time without knowing. Her breath had learned a new road. It would forget and find it again and again. That, too, was part of the learning. The lantern's glow found the pace of the hull, of the wind, of her lungs. It did not blaze. It consented to be exactly bright enough. When at last she turned to go below, a page she had not opened itself somewhere inside her, and she knew, as one knows the exact moment bread is ready to come out, that in the morning, whether morning came in sunlight or under stars, she would begin one small thing with care. Perhaps she would mend the tear in the sleeve of the sailor's coat with thread the color of dawn. Perhaps she would write a letter she did not need to send because the writing would be the sending. Perhaps she would stand on deck and give herself the time to finish breathing the breath she had started without clipping it short for the sake of a task that did not love her. She went below with that certainty. The Somnia breathed around her. The world turned the way a page turns when a kind hand waits for the sentence to finish its thought. And somewhere in the pocket near her heart, the day seed warmed a little more.